How many of you, I know some of you, how many of you out there have written a grant? All right, that's pretty good. It's like at least half. And how many of you are planning on writing a grant in the near future? All right, good. Okay, so I hope that today's talk will inspire you to think about grants in a different way, maybe, help demystify the whole process for those of you who haven't yet tried it, and provide you all with some tips that you can take back to your own grant writing. My name is Erica Wright. I'm the Research Development Lead here at Cal Poly Humboldt Sponsored Programs Foundation. If anybody's unfamiliar with our office, we're the folks that help the campus community find, write, submit, and manage their funding. I've actually been working, helping faculty write grants for like almost 9 years already. That's wild. So, but one of the reasons that I love my job is I get to work with our amazing researchers and not just research, programmatic and creative activities. And so, although the panelists here today primarily write grants for applied research, I think that most of what they're going to say today would be applicable to any discipline and any type of grant. And they're all rock stars, so I hope I'm not making them too, like they're giving me the looks, but they are, and they're really excel at writing really compelling and genuinely enjoyable grants. Like when you see their name on a grant, I'm like, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to enjoy this process, which I don't hear people talk about a lot when they talk about grants, but I think it's actually a really important part of the whole process. So today the discussion is going to revolve around three main questions. I'll ask them how they go about assessing grants to decide if it's a good fit. I'll ask how they build truly authentic contributions, and then the importance of and tips for telling a compelling story. And the plan is to make space after each of those questions for any questions that you all might have. So I'll introduce our panelists. Dr. Erin Kelly is a professor in the Department of Forestry, Fire, and Rangeland Management. And her research focuses on the various ways social, political, economic, and cultural that humans interact with forests. It's very broad. She does a lot of different kinds of things. And Erin brings a good balanced perspective to grants and grant writing and how to write grants that are succinct and effective. Also, outside of work, you can find Erin, aka Cloverkill, on the rink of the Humboldt Roller Derby. And I highly recommend looking up on YouTube the recent episode of Growing Pains, where she and her derby mate, Slam Chowder, talk all things derby.
It's a different talk.
It's a great one. I watched the whole thing. And Dr. Matt Johnson is a professor in the wildlife department, and to be as broad as possible, he studies the relationship between animals and their habitat. So it really does a lot of different kinds of things. It's hard to summarize quickly. He's been on, I think, approximately 47 grants just through our office, and has, which totals almost $10 million. He's worked with a lot of different types of collaborators and has a really good understanding, among other things, of how writing and seeking grants differs from writing and pitching manuscripts. And he's also a really excellent example that one does not have to be pigeonholed by your discipline and the types of grants and funders that you can seek out. So he's been funded through local nonprofits like the Humboldt Area Foundation, as well as national federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, the USDA, the U.S. Department of Education, and also state funders like California Department of Fish and Wildlife. When I asked Matt what his hobbies were, he told me that he likes to play Wordle every day, and his starting word is always crane, and at one time, that was the right answer. And then Dr. Lori Richmond is a professor in environmental science and management. She also works a quarter time as an extension specialist for the California Sea Grant and is the co-chair of the Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise Institute. Her research focus is related to marine, coastal, and community resilience, exploring local coastal issues from both a human and policy perspective. And she works with a number of community and tribal government and private sector collaborators. And one of my most memorable experiences working with Lori actually was navigating a really complicated contract process where there were a lot of different stakeholders from a lot of different backgrounds working on trying to put together a contract where we each had to follow all the policies, procedures, and regulations of our own positions. But everybody came to that table genuinely wanting it to work. And although it could have been a very difficult and painful or even impossible process, it turned out to be really enjoyable and extremely rewarding. And I think that's a good example of what good collaboration can look like. In addition to that, I didn't know this, but Lori loves to surf. So if you see her out there, when she's not writing grants, she's out there surfing. Okay, enough of that introductions. Our first question is, if anybody wants to start to jump in, how do you know if the grant that you found is the right fit? And it could be either for you or for your project.
You want to start?
You're next to the speaker. So.
Oh man. Well, okay. So I think that thanks for inviting us, Erica. Thanks for calling us rock stars. That was really nice. I don't know that I'm always an expert on finding grants, the funders that fit, just because I know that in the beginning I wrote a lot of grants that probably didn't fit. So maybe that makes me an expert because I found ways that to kind of filter that out. But I think that one thing to think about is, as you're looking for RFPs, is that you have a body of work that you're trying to build on, but also you can shape your body of work to fit the RFP. There's kind of a back and forth, and I have in the past been really inspired by well-written RFPs, requests for proposals, that kind of then not dictated what I did, but really changed what I chose to do. Like kind of set me off on a course that maybe I wasn't looking for. So I would say one answer to your question is maybe that you shouldn't always go into a project thinking that you know everything that you want to do. You really have to look at the language of the grant and think about how you fit in it. And in some cases that might actually shape what you decide to do. And I think that my most recent grant was kind of like that. It was kind of in the area that I'm interested in. It's post-wildfire recovery in communities. I'd done pre-wildfire preparedness for communities, but anyway, it was different enough that I had to really think about, like, can I fit here? I had to do like new literature review. I had to find new stuff, but then it really inspired me and it was something that I loved. And so I started to go off that direction. So sometimes I think RFPs or grants can get you going in a new direction.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that a little. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, for me, I think when I first got started, I was approaching grants and RFPs and proposals more like I was approaching manuscripts, thinking, okay, I've got this really great idea, this great, in the case of a proposal, a project idea, different than a completed manuscript, but I just need to pitch it to the right person, find somebody to fund this. Like I need to find the right journal to accept this paper. And it's hard to generalize across grants because there's so many types of grants, but and there are some grants that are a little like that, where it's more like an award for a great idea and a promising person. But a lot of the grants, especially for the applied work, like Aaron was just describing, the funder has an agenda. They want something accomplished. And so if it doesn't matter how good your idea is, if it's not fitting what they want accomplished, if it's not fitting their priorities, you'll never get past step one. So I think finding that balance of having a strong theme in your research lab and choosing projects that fit with that theme, but also being a little bit flexible, like Aaron was describing, and making sure that what you're proposing matches really well to what they're offering or what they're prioritizing is vital. And I would say, one of the biggest pieces of advice, I think, is to try to put yourself in their shoes, right? That works in many areas of life, including when you're writing proposals. So try to put yourself in the reviewer's shoes. And so if you're thinking like, okay, I think this matches pretty well, you want it to match well. You're measuring kind of from the floor, and it seems like it's stacking pretty high. But put yourself in their shoes. They're getting 30 proposals, all of which are well written. they're looking for some reason that it doesn't match very well. They're kind of measuring from the ceiling. So if you think, yeah, I think it's a pretty good match, it might not be that good enough. You know, you really have to make sure that your writing is adhering to their priorities, so you can get, you know, a compelling story.
Yeah, and to follow up in terms of thinking about that fit, I recommend reading the RFP thoroughly. Often they'll have a rubric or a set of points in terms of how they're assessing it, and really thinking like, do I hit all of these pieces? And then in writing, make sure you clearly do. But also, they often have sort of webinars if there's an RFP for grants where they'll sort of answer questions that you have, attending those. And through that, or even informally, just calling up a granting agent, you can be like, I'm thinking about doing this idea. I think it fits in with the lens, but maybe it's a little bit different. What do you think? And I think Erica had the point, you can email them, but over phone they might be more honest because the email, you know, they don't want to appear to be giving any sort of favoritism. But I would say do not hesitate if you have any questions about fit to call, because it's not worth your time. Writing grants is so time consuming. It's not worth your time to do something out of the gate that the funder is not interested in. I will say that I think over my career, I'm sort of like mid-career now. In the beginning, I was just applying for lots of things, and now I'm in a position sometimes I get approached, and so I really think carefully about what grants or projects I want to be a part of. And so I have my own rubric of whether I'm going to put something together and whether it meets those those kinds of goals. And putting together a grant, it's important to think about if you do get the grant. I think sometimes you're like, oh, this is a great idea. It'll probably get funded. It'll look great on my CV. But one of the big questions, which is maybe cheesy to ask myself, is does this bring me joy? Does the thought of doing this for 2 to 5 years make me excited? Or do I think if I get this, I would just feel dread? Like, oh, now I have this thing I have to do. And I don't know about your experience, but I have very few grants where I'm the only person. So they're almost always about collaborators, and I do a lot of work that is community collaborators, fishing communities, tribal partners, coastal communities. And I have collaborated with NGOs. I've had grants of private consultants that do a piece of the work. So also it's important to think, especially if you're getting invited, who's that team, and are you excited to work with those people? So that's something that I ask, like, are these people that I have something I could learn from, or, you know, this is just like a unique opportunity. So those are some of the questions I ask. I do a lot of community center work, so I ask, like, is this a question of relevance to the community? And that is just part of my ethic and method of selecting projects. So I do think, though, it's a good idea to have a little bit, or over time to build, maybe as you learn, like maybe not in the beginning, like do a few, see how it feels. But develop a sense of like what are the types of projects you like to be a part of and you want to be pursuing, because it really is a commitment for, I don't know, I've never had more than a 5-year grant, but 2 to 5 years that I feel like you're on this ship stuck with these these folks, and really think like, does that make you excited? Does that bring you joy? Then that is a good sign that even if it's like a little extension of something new or not exactly what you thought, then maybe it's a good idea to do.
What does your rubric look like?
It's just mental. It's just, I get an email, we're doing this project, do you want to do it? And I go through, it's a gut check. I think about what's on my plate. I had an issue where I just was so excited to have funding to support grad students that I said yes to like 5 projects, and like they all got funded. And I had like the worst 2 years of my life, like trying to do all that work, you know. I was like, oh, like I thought this was cool, but like this is, because even if it's a grad student, it's like committing to a set of coordination meetings, right? Like it's going to fill your schedule. So yeah, it's like a little bit of a gut check, and it's just going through. I might call some of the different partners and see like, what do you think about this idea, or before I pursue something, if there are, you know, different agencies that are touching on it. I don't want to do something that's replicates other things, and yeah, and I try to be inclusive. If someone has an idea, because we merge ideas. Yeah, so do a little bit of emailing around and pondering, and a lot of it kind of is a gut check, which is, I think, it's easy to ignore when you're like,
Yeah.
money, that would be so great to have, you know. So that's something that I really try to keep in mind. And people are wanting you to do something, and that's really flattering to me. But I will say that wasn't I didn't have that in the beginning as you're building a portfolio, but as it grows, I think you can be especially more choosy, and as you're doing it, learn what you like and not like, and build projects like that. Yeah, I had one project with a set of collaborators from NGO consulting firms. We called it the dream team. Like, it was just a team that we came to every meeting and everyone had done their part, and like, I was just like, how can we work together again? That was such an amazing thing to be a part of, to have great collaborators feels so awesome.
Yeah, and this is something, as I've been in this job now for a really long time, and I've noticed a lot of faculty when they first start, we talked about this before, are kind of just putting out feelers in a lot of different places, and it can derail them a little bit. I don't know if you have any specific advice for that. Like, how do you, I do like to try to sit down with people and think about what is your 1 year, 5 year, 10-year plan, and sometimes that's helpful. I don't know if any of you have anything to add to that. Very annoying.
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit. I mean, I think, consistent with what everyone's saying is, trying to find that right fit. And as I mentioned early on in my career, I had this one project that I just really wanted to do. I thought scientifically it would be the next great thing, consistent with what I already had been doing, and just couldn't find the right funder. And so, tried several NGOs, federal agency, none of it was funded. None of them were good fits. I had convinced myself that they were all good fits, but they weren't. And then later something came up where it was an opportunity for, and this I think speaks to Erica's question about, looking for some opportunities, but not trying to spread yourself too thin or go too far afield. It was a training grant for students. And so I wasn't originally looking at those types of grants, but when I saw that, and then I saw the types of activities it would support, then I could see, and this goes back to your point, saying like, oh, I didn't think of doing this project as a training opportunity, but I think I can hit these priorities really well, and the project can also encompass this scientific question. And I think it's also important to sort of recognize, what you're good at, and also what we're good at as Cal Poly Humboldt, right? So we are in a unique position here. We have, amazing students, a strong undergraduate program, strong master's programs. We're not an R1, so if you're pursuing a scientific question that's directly in competition with Harvard and MIT, you can get it, but realize what pool you're in. Whereas if it's a training project or a training grant, we might actually look better than Harvard and MIT in some of those settings, right? So draw on whatever strength you can that's available to you between your collaborators, your institution, your setting, your positionality, whatever, and that can be valuable.
And that's a good point that we didn't mention, which is that when you're looking at a grant, you should look at what the chances are of getting it. And I think that, it's great to go for big hits, like for the NSF grants, but early on, sometimes that's hard unless you're with a more established researcher. But there's a lot of grants that are more targeted, regional. They might only be available to certain audiences, like the ARI grants here that are for in California for CSUs. Those grants are a smaller chunk of work, but like they might not be as big a total amount. But often that's a great way to build a program and to start thinking about a project, is think about grants as, okay, I want to get this. And I was really lucky. There is particular funding in my department, basically. There's a McIntyre Stennis. It's a USDA fund that is available for forestry departments. And so sometimes it's like it's a small grant, but you can also just start with small and start to develop ideas and then build up to bigger grants. I think that.
Okay, were there any questions so far from our audience members? Any questions? No? All right. I will launch us into our next question then. What, and I think all of you can speak to this, so anyone can jump in. What goes into building authentic collaborations?
You better start. You're the rock star here.
I don't know. Well, I will say collaborations are really hard, and they're always a process of learning and making mistakes. So good communication is really important, and that your partners, whether they're community or tribal partners, can let you know when things aren't working, and you can refine over time. I will say for me, the biggest thing about authentic collaborations is to not build them in a grant cycle. That suddenly you see a proposal due in a month or a few weeks, and you're like, this project would be cool. I think it would be cool to work with this tribe or this community. To call them up and say, if you want to do this now, that's generally not very well received and not a great way to build a partnership. So my first step would be to figure out ways to start to build those relationships outside of the context of grants, and to find ways that you can give back first before asking for like a favor, like a letter of support. And this is something that I've learned over time, but we talked about the Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise Institute is sort of envisioned as an academic tribal community partnership on sea level rise. And it's a group that meets once a month, and it's got tribal folks from local government, folks from agencies, folks from NGOs. And we have this established relationship. So now that that network's been built, like there was a call for coastal environmental justice, and I just send it out. I'm like, anyone interested in this? And like at a meeting, 5 people are. We just have a meeting, and the We At Tribal Partners, like we've been really wanting to do this with that funding, and we put together a proposal. And so instead of being like, I have this idea for a project, like and emailing them a month before it's due, like the relationships are already built. So exchanging letters of support, and sometimes it makes sense that a partner's the lead, and sometimes it makes sense the university is the lead, and just like exchanging those things. So I will say that's really important, just build those relationships outside of the cycle and outside of just wanting something. The other thing I think is in terms of building your project, thinking about it in budgeting is really important. That any kind of partners, making sure everyone feels good about their budget. And it's really interesting in budget, having worked with like consultants and communities and NGOs, and everyone's paid different rates in different ways. But it's making sure everybody feels like they're supported in their work. And that can be through funding, through subawards to folks. It can be through funding community liaisons on projects, including stipends or honoraria for folks who are going to participate into meetings. And there's a conversation around authentic and transparent budgeting, but I will say, like, I almost feel like if I were reviewing grants for collaboration, that's the first place I would look in their budget to see like how authentic is this, because where is the money going? Making sure that there's budget for your partners.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to build relationships. It's maybe, I don't know that this is always transferable, but I think all 3 of us do a lot of community-based work, something that's kind of local, and so actually volunteering and getting out and doing stuff with people makes it a lot easier to do that kind of work. I think it's really hard to do work that's really like located far away from where you are. So I admire people who are able to do that and establish relationships far away. But for me, I've gotten involved, like I'm on the board of something, or I do other work that is, it's volunteer work or service work. But then I feel like those opportunities might come up for working together on something like a grant, or it might just be that you make these great connections with people and you figure out more questions to ask and you figure out what people's priorities and needs are. And so it doesn't always have to lead to like directly collaborating on a grant. Sometimes you just can identify better kind of what's going on around you. And that can make the whole writing process so much better and more enjoyable, because you're like, I know that this is a need, and I know I can sort of, pitch this, I guess, to the granting agency, because I know that this is a real gap, not just like an academic gap, but it's something that people really could benefit from.
Yeah, I would maybe agree with all those points, add just a couple things. One is, all these bits of advice are especially powerful and meaningful and relevant for collaborators outside of academia. So getting your partners, I work with a lot of farmers, very analogous to what you were describing about, building relationships with those folks outside of the grant cycle, and recognizing that the granting process is going to be, for some of them, pretty unfamiliar. So the idea of asking for a reference letter might seem, they're not going to be familiar with that, and so talking them through that, depending on who you're collaborating with. And you build that, you invest time into those relationships well ahead of when you might be, working together on a grant. And that's fun too. I mean, that's not just like, you do that because later it's going to pay dividends. Like, working with the community is rewarding in itself. So even if it doesn't end up in some great grant thing, that's good too. But a flip side is with the academic collaborators. So in many cases, I've reached out to somebody outside of my discipline, so an economist or a botanist, entomologist, to collaborate on some projects that I've done. And in several of those cases, they've been just cold calls, like just email them. Here's this RFP. It's due in 2 months. I'm thinking of this idea. Here's a skeleton. Would you be interested in talking about this? And, sometimes they're too busy, or I'm not in that position anymore. I've moved on, because you maybe I find their names from the literature. Like, okay, this person seems like they might be interested. Have never met them, nothing, just an email, bam. You give it a shot, and it's worked out really well sometimes. So that's a possibility. And unlike, some of the community partners, they know the gig a lot better, right? They already know grant cycles, what that means, what the timing is, what might be expected of them, especially if they're established. So it can work adequately in those cases to have a little bit of a shorter timeline, and to just call them out of the blue. Not the week before, but
Yes, a question from our audience.
Dr. Jones, I was doing some personal research in the Calistoga area a few weekends ago. And one of the research facilities I visited was pointing out the owl boxes along the Great Vineyard.
Right.
So you talked about building relationships with clients, and I was wondering, it's not, you don't go to it, how did you do that? How did you start building these relationships with farmers?
Specifically in Calistoga, is that the?
Yeah. So I've got a long standing research project going on in Napa Valley, including Calistoga, several different projects over the years. And yeah, the way that first started is I had been doing some research in a similar topic, that is wildlife, helping farmers out in the tropics. And I was looking for a place to do it a little closer to home. A lot of my projects have been not that close to home. Napa's like my closest project. So I guess I have a couple more local, but a lot of the work has been a little bit further afield. So yeah, we saw these owl boxes on the vineyards. I say we, my graduate students and I. And so yeah, we just started knocking on doors and asking people, what's going on with the owl boxes? We're biologists. We're interested in that. Is there some research question that's interesting to you? This goes back to the question about collaboration and partners. One of the things early on that I did in that system is I and a collaborator from Israel, again, a cold call, biologists in Israel, we applied for a grant that brought a bunch of biologists together who study animals on farms and a bunch of farmers together. And we had a workshop at UC Davis. and we outlined a bunch of research priorities and questions that were informed by the farmers. Did not lead to a publication, led to a report, but we have used that report in almost every grant application since, right? Because it's really powerful. These were questions, informed by legitimate, authentic collaboration with the community. So, I think if you've got an opportunity to formalize your stakeholders' interests, either in a report or a manuscript or a workshop or something like that, that can be really valuable because it demonstrates that outside of the granting cycle, you're making those efforts to understand what their needs are.
And I've a couple times had the experience. Well, one time I was involved with a group called California Women in Timber, and they give scholarships. And the president of California Women in Timber then approached me wanting to be a grad student. And she had been a forester in the area and she wanted to do social science. And so then she knew a whole bunch of landowners in the area. And so we just developed a project around her knowledge of the landowners. And it was this incredibly, in that case, it's actually leaning on her connections. And I had another graduate student who I knew from working with the Mattole Restoration Council, and she was down in the Mattole. She worked for another nonprofit, and she wanted to do some work. And I was like, well, let's do some work in the Mattole. And so we used her connections down in the Mattole. And I'm not saying that you can always depend on the grad students, but I think sometimes graduate students have a ton of background and knowledge and local connections. And I've found a lot of success with kind of like, well, you're already part of this community. If we're going to do a project, like let's kind of lean on that. So twice that happened for me. That's a little bit of a different angle. Rather than kind of pulling people in, you actually have a partner who is going to do the research. In this case, they were graduate students who are already embedded. But you can also develop those relationships with people by having community partners, and then they're the ones who know. You're the researcher, but you have these community partners that sometimes have a lot of who've already built the connections. And so you're sort of coming in, asking questions that the community partner tells you is important.
And one other type of collaboration that you spoke about before, maybe it was you, Lori, but maybe everybody, was when you first got started, you didn't just go off on your own to get a grant, did you?
Yeah, especially I see some grad students in here, so there's like different advice for different levels of career. But I will say, I learned about writing for grants and especially running grants. It's really hard. I feel like it doesn't always suit my skill set, like budget management or like OBI is still a mystery to me half the time. And, some of it's conflict resolution and managing a team. But I learned a lot about that by being sort of like a co-PI or research associate on a grant someone else wrote. So if some of you grad students are embedded in a project, use that as an opportunity. I actually give my graduate students embedded in projects like small project management roles, like have them keep tabs on the budget and do help with some of the reporting and things like that. So I think that's a great opportunity to grow in that. And I will say faculty that are higher up to really look as there are new faculty coming into campus, can you fold them into a project to give them some of that experience, and then they can move up to doing that. So yeah, I think that's a great opportunity as well.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Any other questions from our audience? Any questions? No questions? Nothing else to ask? Okay. I'll move into our last question, which is, what is the importance of, and how do you go about telling a compelling story? So there are a lot of different ways that we approach that question. Who would like to go first? You're all really good at it.
Okay. So one thing I think about in telling a story in a grant is that you are not trying to write a journal article. I think Matt already mentioned this. You're not trying to make any kind of big claim. I really think that you're trying to welcome someone in and show them a problem that you have found and demonstrate that this is something that they should care about. That's what I think about. And so make the language accessible. I mean, it has to be, you have to use the language of your, field, but you want to write something where the people who are reviewing it, well, and actually I should just for 1 second mention that you should review grants also if you get the opportunity, and see how people write grants, and you'll see what pops out to you. But write that grant so that the reviewers are sitting there and thinking, yeah, oh geez, this really is an issue that, and they clearly can answer this question. And so I think making the language accessible and clear, and making it so clear what your research question is, like bolding it, or, like just don't make anything hidden. Like you're not trying to spring something on them or like bury the lead. Just make it super clear what you're asking and why there's a need for it.
I think if they have questions, you're in trouble. Like it doesn't usually go well if the reviewers
have
yeah, if the
questions.
reviewers have
Yeah.
questions.
Oh, I don't know.
What do you think, Zach?
Reviewers often ask follow-up. I don't know, not always, but I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because it means that maybe they're trying to.
There's two kinds of questions. I think
Okay,
Eric
yeah.
is like, what is this about? Like,
Yeah.
I'm confused. Does this meet our priorities? Like,
All right.
like the reader should be able to like almost glance at it and know those key topics.
I bet reviews
But they
are
could
really
be so
different.
inspired that they're like, I want to know more about this forestry question. Then that's like probably a good
Yeah.
question to inspire.
California Arts Council was completely like, I had boxes to check, like, and there was no interaction with any, no follow-up opportunities. It was very anonymous and yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been able to get questions from a funder on a proposal and then you could revise. Has that happened to you?
It happened once, and it might have happened twice. I think it's depends on the funder, but I was told by somebody else that this was common for this funder, and that it meant that they just wanted you to clarify something, and then they can fund it. I don't know. They were looking for something very specific.
Yeah, I've had a couple of those.
Yeah, the compelling story thing. I think we're all familiar with writing a proposal as a graduate student or writing a manuscript as a scholar. You have to have some justification in there, right? You have to convince your reader that this is important. So you're familiar with that basic idea. You have to hit that really hard with a grant proposal. I think justifying why this project is needed at this time with this group of people in this setting, you have to sort of try to set the stage that this is the perfect combination, the dream team kind of, concept. I think that's important. And then, and as I said earlier, trying to get into the shoes of the reviewer, it depends on your funder. So if I'm writing a grant or a proposal to the USDA, and it happens to be specifically about my project, which is barn owls and vineyards, the reviewers may not know that much about the details of even, wildlife ecology. It might be more general agricultural scientists reviewing it. So you want to be really careful about how you're describing the details and terminology, like you were saying, making it very accessible. I mean, you're going to be reviewed by very smart, very discerning people who may not know that much about your topic. That's kind of a difference than when you send a manuscript in, when you can be sure you're getting the people who know a lot about your topic, maybe even have published on exactly that topic before. So it's a pretty different audience, or it can be. Looking at the RFP, contacting the program officer, try to understand who those reviewers are, because that's who you're writing to.
Yeah, I think I'll add a lot of my work is applied, so it may be different in different fields, but I almost never have a literature review section. So I would say start with a story and make it real about real people, places, and things. And I think depending if it's NSF, those proposals tend to have more of the science and the literature in them, but so I think start with a story, not these 4 scholars have said this, and then 3 have said this, and we've got to get to the bottom of it. But seas are rising faster in Humboldt Bay than anywhere on the West Coast, and these communities are at risk, and we need to do something, right? That's a more kind of compelling story and hook. So yeah, start with the story, not literature. I actually was really compelled by something Erin said earlier, but believe in it. And I think, she was talking about like just really, like if you believe in it and you believe your project like fits the grant, like I just feel like that belief can really shine through in the narrative. Like my first big proposal got funded, I was just like, this absolutely like is the perfect project. It stemmed from a demonstrated need from previous study. I've got community partners, and like every bullet point they want, they have. Like, how could they say no? And you just kind of believe. I think that belief you can kind of see, and it's like even this team is uniquely qualified to do this work. And I will say, make it look nice. Like have bolded headings, have subheadings. Like Matt even talked about, like sometimes bulleted lists are fine, but like if you've ever been a reviewer, the people that are like, all right, it's a 10-page proposal, and they make the margins tiny, and they have like the smallest font possible, and they don't have space between the headings. And you're reading that, and you're like, it's the opposite of wanting a cup of tea. You're like, this is like an immediate headache, And so you want to make it pleasant to consume. So cut, make it more concise. Yeah, and I would say like just really pay attention to making it look nice. Have nice looking visuals in there. Make it an appealing text to read.
Yeah, one quick thing to add to that, I totally agree. And like Erica was saying, sometimes the review process is very formulaic, and sometimes they provide a rubric, like there's going to be 10 points for this section and 12 points for this section, and even maybe some bullet points underneath those saying what they're expecting to see. Put those things in those sections. Even if you feel like, I kind of already touched it on it earlier in section B, if you're not getting points for it in section B, you might get points for it in section D if it's there. So yeah, make sure you put all those things where they should be, even if it means, gosh, I kind of feel like I said this already. Make sure you get it in the right spot if they're using that sort of formulaic rubric.
Thank you for mentioning the review criteria. Erin, you had also mentioned earlier about using tables instead of narrating everything. Would you like to talk about that more? I think that people struggle with that sometimes, like how, when, where.
I don't know how. I will almost always, especially with student writing, I think that there's a lot of long sentences or paragraphs that are that can be made into tables. And so anytime that you can think about, okay, what am I trying to compare across these things, make it into a table, I think that it's just easier to look at. And also people tend to, if they're flipping through, they'll gravitate towards a table. Same thing with a figure. Like if you can demonstrate how a system works, if you're doing some kind of research and you're trying to somehow like fill in a gap in a system and answer a question that's part of it, draw the system as best you can. And that'll even like help clarify in your own mind what question you're asking and how it fits. Because I think that if you can put things in tables and figures, often it's actually clearer to you as well. It's kind of an exercise in making things better for yourself. Because writing at a certain point, it just gets tough to digest. So yeah, I like figures and tables. I was thinking also, somebody mentioned headers. One thing that I always have my grad students do is write titles before they think they're ready. So like they're always like, oh, I don't really have a title. They'll just give you some writing, and I'm like, make a title, because a title tells you what's important and what you're focusing on and what I'm supposed to learn from this. And so I would say that having a really good title is maybe an undervalued thing. Like it's something that's super important, and people kind of leave it to the end. And I think start with a title and headings, and then, I mean, it doesn't have to be the very first thing, but I think it's super important to have a title that is like, grabs you. It doesn't have to be a pun, but I like sort of silly things.
Awesome. Anything else to add from anybody?
Matt, I just remember you saying like sometimes you'll have a grant, like they want you to list objectives and deliverables, and you'll have like objective 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you go back and you're like, oh, 1, oh, 4, and when you're a reader, you didn't remember what 01 was. So yeah, like give it a like easy, accessible heading. But yeah, you'll have these objectives, make them bold, and make subheadings underneath them, and make them organized. But yeah, nothing to where like the reviewer has to do work to go back to like the beginning of what you wrote to like remember what you're actually talking about. Just again, make it so easy for them.
And I think maybe you were saying, Erin, earlier when we were talking that all this stuff is relevant to all kinds of stuff. We were talking about RTP files, right? Making things, bolding things, making things really clear, so it's not necessarily just for grants. So you can practice lots of elements.
Yeah, making things accessible is really is a good practice, I think, for any academic writing. Or if you go into agencies, like if you end up working for an agency, like writing white papers, writing for nonprofits, everybody wants information that they can easily access. I think it's only in journal articles where sometimes you end up like go to town with your long sentences and stuff, but that's a different kind of writing.
Yes, a question.
More for Matt and Erin. When you do the more NSF type grants, how do you balance how hard you hit the literature?
Well, yeah, I think in my experience with NSF, hitting the literature pretty hard is important. It's a little different than, like Erin was saying earlier, and trying to show that, you know, there is some research gap that you're going to hope to fill. And then, I mean, in the case where I did have some success with NSF, that was more of a research-oriented grant. I think part of the reason I had success there was I was, you know, looking at sort of one area of literature, and they were doing some really interesting things here, and another area of literature that was doing some interesting things there, and I tried to bring those two together. So I think, you know, with the NSF or those other award-type grants that are more emphasizing intellectual merit than having an agenda and priority, really establishing that and trying to do something novel by bringing two areas together or pushing it in a totally different area, you know, becomes more important.
Yeah, I'll just add that I am auxiliary part of two NSF projects that got funded that I didn't lead, and that I was just invited into. And those proposals are so different. I was like, these will never be funded. They're so dense, and it was like all these like jargon and literature, and they were both funded. So I do think it is important. Maybe NSF usually makes available other applications. So yeah, that is probably not 100% following a lot of what I've talked about here, what happens in NSF. But I also know one of the ones that got funded was submitted twice, which I think is pretty common in NSF, and so you can take your stab at it and get some feedback and hone it.
Yeah, that's a good bit of advice too, just in general. Sorry.
I'm done.
Yeah. But with the manuscripts, you know, I always feel like, well, when I finish the manuscript or work with a bunch of students and we finish the manuscript, it's like, okay, I'm confident this is going to be published somewhere. Maybe not our first or second choice, but we'll eventually get it published. Grants aren't like that, except for maybe the NSF ones where you can apply, you know, multiple years to the same program. A lot of grants change a lot from year to year to year. So yeah, look at it really carefully about your chances. And then also look at the history of that funder. Has this one come up in multiple years? If it has, then that might make it a little bit more attractive in your mental rubric because you feel like, well, I mean, I get it this time, but I got a chance to get it another time.
Good. Do we have any other questions out there in the audience? It's a very quiet audience today. Anything else that any of you wanted to say? Anything we missed?
I just see some grad students in here. I'm curious, you know, your interest in this workshop and what grant writing you all are pursuing and what advice you guys writing GRFPs. Are you guys, what's going on? Yeah. Yeah, although I was going to say the one exception to that is like 2 pages of the GRFP. Like find that weird citation format that takes no space. So that would be an example where you would push the margin limits and the text size limits because all they give you is 2 pages. But even then, if you can give, like, you don't even want to give the space for the heading because you're like, it takes up room, but like give the space for the heading. But I will say that as an example that's a little bit different. I think it is really great to look at past funded if you can get a hold of some. And in general, the GRFP feels to me like just a little bit of a, it's dependent on who does your reviews. Like it's so sometimes because it's just so competitive that you just happen to get a set of reviewers that are favorable to like your particular thing or not, and that's kind of hard to prepare for. But I would try to seek out some that have been funded and you do want to worry. You can have the small font and do all the tricks for that because it's only 2 pages.
Question for if you guys were how would you, where would you look for funding? What kind of grants would you go for? What kind of resources for finding funding for public community?
Well, I think one thing is to go to conferences or to go to any kind of professional meeting of people that are in your field, and talk to other people. Because for one thing, you might, I don't know exactly what field you're in, but you might meet people who are from the funding agencies who are going to have ideas. But then also you're going to meet people who've gotten funding in your field, and they'll tell you about it. And then also most professional organizations have listservs of different kinds, and they'll send out to their listservs. So like, what's your field? Well, yeah. So there's all these listservs that focus on wildlife, and they'll send out RFPs on those. And so, those can be like all over the place. But I feel like once you kind of get all these emails about it, you'll start to see kind of patterns, and you'll start to see maybe things that appeal to you. And I look in the language of the RFP of like, does this kind of appeal to me in a way? Like, are they saying things in a way where I can see myself in it? But I do think that meetings is where you do the most kind of learning about your field, and you get to know what's out there. And also it makes it a little bit more real, I guess, because you get to talk to people about funding opportunities, and it's not just a piece of paper,
An email listserv, like join the society for something. Conservation biology or something, you'll see things. And there are grad opportunities that are really small, like a few $100. Some of them are 1,000. Some are based on your project, and some is just based on you being a cool person. They want to back. But I'd go for some of those smaller things to get the experience, I would say. And then that looks great when you're applying for jobs. You have a list of grants you've gotten, even if some of them are pretty small. I think even the university has some different scholarship opportunities linked to, and your advisor is going to know your field, so that I think just let them know you're interested, and they can connect you to you. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there's a big difference if you're trying to fund all or a big portion of your project versus some supplementary funds, right? So I agree. I think, going for those smaller grants is kind of a supplementary piece. And I think in those cases, it can be good to say, well, I've already got some funding to do this project, but what I don't have is the $1,200 I need for the special camera that would allow me to do this really cool complementary thing. Or I don't have the $2,000 to employ an undergraduate student for 3 weeks. Find some hook there that's kind of a sexy add-on to the project that you already have funding for. I think that can sometimes make a compelling story for those smaller bits. And yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to sort of build your portfolio or build your CV.
Yes.
Just in case anyone who doesn't know, could you tell us what an RFP is?
What is an
You gotta learn a
RFP?
new language to apply for grants. Request for proposal. So, or it's like a funding call. So an agency or a foundation or the National Science Foundation will say, we are going to fund projects like this. And it's usually a long document of like what their priorities are for funding. They'll often say like what the funding amount available is, from 50 to 100,000 or from 5 to 10 million. Like, so you can see like what budget you can go for. And then they'll usually have really detailed descriptions of like what they expect in the narrative. Is it a 5-page narrative? Is it a 12-page narrative? If there may be a rubric of this is how things will be evaluated. So usually there is like a PDF of a grant, a funder will send that call out. And yeah, that's sort of like your guidebook. And you don't look at that in detail to your peril, I
Right.
think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And people in the sponsored programs office can help a lot. Like even with basic things like who qualifies. Sometimes there's a lot of detail about who qualifies. Like if it's a grant that kind of targets certain university types or certain fields, and so working with sponsored programs folks like Erica can really help you to make sure that you actually meet the parameters of what they're looking for. So that's in the RBF.
Yeah, sometimes we don't qualify as rural, and I'm just like, really? Have you
Yeah.
been here?
But we are a 501(c), so that was something I didn't understand at first. I was like, well, this grant proposal, this RFP looks like it's for nonprofits. I'm at the university, that's not really but the Sponsored Programs Foundation is a 501(c). So, I mean, you read some more, they might be looking for nonprofits as you're thinking of them, but yeah. And the SPF office is great at interpreting. There's some grantees kind of language stuff that's really not obvious at first, and SPF is great about helping you understand that.
Yeah, I probably should have said that. We're here to help you. So if you have questions, you can always ask us and send anything to us or come talk to us. So thank you. All right, well, I think that concludes our session. Thank you so much to you three for coming and for everyone for joining us today and talking about grants.
All right.
Thanks for organizing.